with that.
That's fine.
Let's go with that. Probably want to know a little bit about me. My name is Hillel. I'm a guitar player for the Red Hot Chili Peppers. I'm at beautiful Miami Beach, and there's a cool wind that brings a shrivel to my nipple. But I love you all, and you probably want to know even more about me, don't you, Dave?
I do indeed. Tell me how you actually hooked up with the rest of the guys in the band.
I found the guys in high school. High school is where I found them. And they found me, and we started. The Peppers actually came to be about 3 years after we graduated high school, which was the class of 1980. And I'm 25 years old now, and I was born in Israel, and I came to America when I was 4, and now I play Stratocaster in the band, and I love it, and I love it. I love you.
Hillel Slovak was born on April 13th, 1962, in Haifa, Israel. He was born to Jewish parents that survived the Holocaust. His mother, Esther Rachel Tintvass, was born on February 12, 1936, in Warsaw, Poland. His father, Tommy Slovak, grew up in what was formerly Yugoslavia. The family moved to Queens, New York City, and then relocated to Southern California in 1967. A couple of sources state that Hillel's family moved to Nahariya after living in Haifa, and then later moved to a kibbutz. They immigrated to the U.S., and in one interview, Hillel's mother had stated that she had family in the U.S. One record shows that Hillel's parents got divorced in July of 1970. As a child, Hillel was interested in art and often spent time painting with his mother. He attended Laurel Elementary School in West Hollywood, then Bancroft Junior High School, where he met future bandmates Jack Irons and Michael Balsery, who is also known today as Flea. At the age of 13, Hillel received his first guitar as a bar mitzvah present. He would regularly play the instrument into the late hours of the night, keeping his younger brother James awake at times. Some of his influences were Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, and Kiss. Hillel went to Fairfax High School, and in his freshman year formed a band with Jack Irons on drums, Alan Johannes, and Todd Strassman. The band was called Chain Reaction. After their first gig, they called the band Anthem. Anthem was then renamed to Anthem with a Y, as there was already a band with the original spelling of the name. Flea remembered of the band saying, "Hillel was occasionally the lead vocalist too, but even though his soulful and arty guitar style rocked righteously, he was a terrible singer. Almost as bad as me, and I'm awful. I'd seen them do gigs at school and been to watch them at band practice once or twice. As our friendship deepened, I started to soften up to rock music. I liked that they just played the stuff without any teachers around, and they didn't have to read music. They just did it on their own. Hanging out with them sweetened my sour grapes." Flea first met Hillel in junior high school, as written in his book. He was just on the periphery of my awareness then. I first really noticed him when he and Jack Irons showed up to school one day, dressed as Kiss. Hillel was Ace Frehley, and he blew me away because it didn't feel like a goofy Halloween costume. He transformed from a geeky kid into a bigger-than-life rock star. I was impressed, and I didn't even like rock music. However, when he and Jack and a couple other kids enthusiastically lip-synced some Kiss songs for the school talent show, pursing lips and high-kicking, their commitment affected me. That talent show was also the time Hillel and Jack decided to start playing real instruments. I was in love with Hillel. His Picasso face, long curly hair and slim physique, the red messenger guitar slung over his shoulder, his rock star aspirations. Hillel was the artist. Hillel made me feel like I was part of something special, that we shared magic bonded by a secret understanding. I knew something exciting was in store. We all came from broken homes and lower middle class backgrounds. While waiting in line at McDonald's, a large man ordering at the counter became argumentative and angry. He was a furious psycho. He snapped and lost it, his anger escalating insanely, spinning around to the rest of the patrons and yelling, "I'm gonna have to hurt somebody!" Fear shot through the fast food crowd. He stared at Hillel, who calmly deadpanned, "How about Mayor McCheese?" pointing at a standing cardboard cutout of said character. The maniac's hardened face softened as the situation diffused. We became the Faces, a kind of inside joke of a gang. Hillel was not a thief like me and Anthony, nor was he willing to take the physical risks we took daily. But he sure liked getting high with us, listening to music, long deep talks, acting the theater of the absurd, and chasing girls. That's when we saw Hillel drive by in his green Datsun 510, cranking Russian's La Via Stringiato. We yelled to each other, "That's that dude Hillel. He's in my social studies class. He's cool. We know him." We ran down at the stoplight and he graciously gave us a ride. It was a marriage divined in the cosmos, and it was not long before our twosome became a threesome. Hillel. Zillions of powerful memories flow through me, and I'm lost in a thick forest of feelings when I write his name. I'm incapable of directing the ink in this pen to make the marks that describe the deep and complicated young man he was. Smart, handsome, soulful, romantic, creative, and funny as hell. A skinny Israeli boy with a slinky and obscure way of dressing. He knew how to lay back, way, way back, in between the strange dances, the deep paintings, and the shiver your timbers sense of humor. What a beautiful boy he was. What an artist he will always be. The arc of his life went by in a flash, but it didn't seem too fast at the time, and we savored every minute of it. Anthony wrote about Hillel in his autobiography Scar Tissue, first appearing on page 64. I saw a silly group called Anthem play. Every so often we'd have weird local high school rock bands that would play on the outdoor stage on the quad at Fairfax. When I say silly, don't get me wrong. All these guys were really talented, but they were a little behind the times as far as I was concerned. They were doing covers of Queen and Led Zeppelin, all these bands whose times had come to an end, and they all had these big, poodly-looking, long, curly hairdos. At the gig, some people were passing out homemade rectangular Anthem buttons, so I took one. I was wearing the pin one day when I ran into one of the guitar players from Anthem. His name was Hillel Slovak. We started talking and he invited me over to his house for a snack. Anthony stated that he knew within moments of hanging out with Hillel that the guitarist was absolutely different from most of the people that he spent time with. Where Anthony felt like the leader in relationships with other kids his age, Hillel felt like an equal, even knowing many things that Anthony did not. Within a few minutes of hanging out with Hillel, I sensed that he was absolutely different from most of the people I'd spent time with. He understood a lot about music. He was a great visual artist, and he had a sense of self and a calm about him that were just riveting. Hillel was Jewish. He looked Jewish and talked about Jewish stuff. And the food in that kitchen was Jewish. He made us egg salad sandwiches on rye bread that day, which was totally exotic food to me then. After the sandwiches, we had a meaningful, heart-to-heart chat. By the time I left his house, I was thinking, well, that's my new best friend for life right there. Sometimes you just know. Hillel and Anthony would spend many, many nights driving to the top of the Hollywood Hills, pulling into a rest stop, looking over the city, putting on some crazy progressive rock tapes, smoking weed, and discussing the girls at Fairfax. As a teen, Anthony broke his back and ended up in the hospital. During his first week, he got visits from Flea and Hillel. He had to be in traction to reset his vertebrae and started going stir-crazy after 2 weeks. One day, Hillel came to visit, where Anthony told him, "I can't stay here any longer. You have to get me out of here." Hillel went downstairs to get the car ready, and Anthony unstrapped the girdle, rolled over, and got up on his 2 feeble legs. With my bare ass flashing out of the hospital gown, I started lurching like Frankenstein down the hallway. All the nurses went crazy, screaming that I couldn't go anywhere for 2 more weeks. But I didn't care. Somehow I made it down the steps, and Hillel helped me into the car. Before I went home, I made him drive me to the building where I had messed up, so I could try to figure out what I'd done wrong. The book doesn't seem to say what the error was. Anthony had initially tried to jump into a pool and didn't make it. Flea's book states that Anthony hit the side of the pool. Eventually, Anthony Kiedis moved out of the house that he lived in with his father, which was turbulent. And he moved in with a friend named Donde, or Dondi, which is how it was spelled by Flea. Dondi Baston had dropped out of high school at age 16 and made a living selling weed. By his own admission, Anthony said that the house was a party house, where drugs and alcohol were consumed. He claimed that they were working to perfection and not interfering with getting work done, and no one was strung out on anything. Dondi always seemed to come up with some cocaine for these parties, and cocaine then was a treat, not something that we had all the time, so we weren't carried away with it. During this same time, Anthony and Hillel's friendship strengthened, where Anthony would get bathroom passes and then visit Hillel's art class and have deep conversations with him. This was also the time that Hillel taught Flea how to play bass, in secret. Todd, the bass player to Anthem, provided the sound system for the band, and even by Anthony wasn't considered to be a good musician. Todd walked in on rehearsal one day and saw Flea playing Anthem songs on Todd's own bass, on Todd's own amp. He took his things and quit. Flea wrote in his book that he's unsure if Todd ever played music ever again. In my personal opinion, I think that part of the reason that Hillel taught Flea bass was so that he could have someone play in tune with him, at least to be in rhythm with his own guitar work. In Flea's book, he wrote, "Then Hillel, speaking of Anthem bassist Todd Strassman, said, 'Mike, you know I don't get along with Todd so great. I just don't think that he's into it. He doesn't take the jams seriously. He's not willing to give his life over to the music. What do you think about learning to play bass and taking his place?'" Yes. In that moment, I felt completely loved, maybe more than any time ever before. Excitedly, I ran out and got hold of an inexpensive little Fender beginner bass and started banging away at it. I had one bass lesson with Hillel. He told me to use the first 2 fingers on my right hand as the plucking ones, alternately, like they were walking. I only had to walk a few blocks to his house where he lived with his mother and little brother, who drew the most creative cartoons. Hillel and I spent hours and hours listening to his rock records. Hendrix, the mighty Led Zepp, Rush, Jeff Beck, The Doors. I was a jazz geek. It was all new to me. I felt the Hendrix deep inside my little heart. Lying on his living room floor, I fell in love with rock music, listening to Houses of the Holy and leafing through his mom's M.C. Escher book, the rhythms morphing in and out of each other. I imagined them throwing me around like a ferocious wave, contorting me into new shapes and giving me wings. I started looking at music in a new way, seeing color and attitude instead of notes and scales. Hillel's rock star dreams beamed around the room. They were infectious, his yearning hitting me in the chest. Shortly after, Anthem entered a Battle of the Bands competition, winning second place. The band began to play at nightclubs, despite all the members being underage at the time. Flea wrote in his book that Hillel thought about changing his name to David Sandhart as a rock star name. Anthony had asked Hillel if he could introduce Anthem before the band played more of their shows, to which Hillel agreed. He just used an introduction much like his father would do before introducing his friends as bands. When Hillel met Anthony, the latter was taken on as a roadie and hype man for the band. Eventually, Flea, Hillel, and Anthony became very close friends. Hillel was really into weed, which other members of Anthem weren't. The three were into insanity and pushing the envelope, as Anthony recalled. Me, Mike, and Hillel became the real Three Musketeers for the next 2 years in high school. We created alternate identities, 3 Mexicans who spoke in stylized Cheech and Chong accents. I was fuerte, strong, Mike was poco, small, and Hillel was flaco, slender. Together we were Los Faces. We were a gang, but not a ruffian gang. We were a comedy gang. We spent hours and hours playing these characters, and it helped us develop a sense of camaraderie that would last for years. Sometime after high school graduation, Anthem recorded a demo. One of the songs, Clocks, was played on the radio station K West, where all the band members had waited by a radio to hear the song on air. After graduating high school, the band Anthem decided to change their name. A couple of Hillel suggestions were Lorna Green's Dog and The Captain's Log. In the end, they changed their name to What Is This? The name was a nod to the initial reaction people would have to hearing the band play on stage. Despite various references online, the band name actually didn't have a question mark at the end, according to one 1984 interview. Hillel and Alan said that the band's name was a statement.
Under What Is This, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No question mark at the end of the name.
No.
So it's a statement, or
Sure.
explain?
Kind of.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. You just explained it.
I just explained it.
That's the way we always put it.
There was never any chance of putting a question mark there. Now you wanted to show us this before. This is your new face?
It's my new face. I'm working on it.
It's a vulture look. It's quite efficient, especially early in the mornings. It cracks everybody up instantly.
Been sleeping on floors for the past week.
MCA doesn't
My
pay for
back
your
hurts.
hotels?
They do,
Yeah,
kind
they
of,
do,
yeah.
but-
But we ended up staying in New York more than we were planning on it, which is good because it's fun here.
Yeah,
So
we've been here a week
sleeping
already. We've been running around. It's been great.
What is this?
In 1984, What Is This released their debut EP, Squeezed. Around this time, Hillel became uncertain of his role in What Is This and decided to rejoin the Peppers. He left What Is This in 1984, midway through recording What Is This's self-titled album. At this point, the band became a trio, and a final EP called 3 out of 5 Live was made. After this, the band broke up, and Jack Irons would later rejoin the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Hillel is credited with writing the song Stuck. There's a song floating around called Flow that has Hillel on vocals. It's very funk, almost a dance kind of type of song, where you can hear the foundation to what would later become Red Hot Chili Pepper tracks. The official lyrics are not posted anywhere, as far as I know, but from what I was able to hear, I personally think that it was a very beautiful song. I tried my best to decipher the lyrics and even used some software to separate the vocal and instrumental tracks, though the difference was minimal. I already read the lyrics and posted it in another video, so I'm just going to quickly go over my interpretation of the song. My interpretation of the song is that it's quite bluntly about heroin. Or maybe for the sake of YouTube, I'll just say H. My interpretation of the song is that it's about H. It comes off as the deep, deep dreams that Hillel might have seen while high. I've never been on or used opioids, so I don't know what that high is like. But by the way the song is written, it comes off like knowing that the flow is something which can drown you, though one can't help but be tempted to fall into the river, to lose yourself in the river's flow as it takes you on a journey, seeing things you wouldn't have otherwise. The river will take you on a journey all the way out to the ocean. The flow is also a metaphor to me, about the drug flowing inside you as you think these things. Never Say Die isn't so much a lyric about trying to come off as a daredevil, but a statement of, I already know that this can kill me. Don't remind me. The puncture chemicals are clearly about the needle use. I imagine that it's like Hillel would go on a trip, and this type of high would make it feel like time had slowed down, and in some ways as slow as the passing of a freight train. Your love, as he talks about, is like the dark, twisted relationship someone can have, where it makes you feel so good, yet so bad. Heroin would inspire him in some ways to create such beautiful art, music, and other things, though the abuse of the drug would cause him to lose his footing in the river. Every time. The drug may have made him feel the common opioid euphoria, feeling its quote-unquote love. Such dark, twisted love that resulted in successful songs, yes, hit songs and popularity, success. A love, though, that was so dark and abusive that kills you a little more each time. Yet with things like a hit song, it makes that love, perhaps even the love of the drug, worth it. I feel like the song has those small tendrils of danger, like slowly showing the danger of taking the drug, despite the ideas, inspiration, and lucid, vivid thoughts that a person can see or feel when on a trip. I feel like the lyrics are a sort of interpretation of the mind-altering feelings one can feel on a trip, really of any sort of drug, where the bounds of reality are changed. While there is gravity when you're sober and awake, taking a drug can change your perception of reality. In some ways, I wonder if Hillel would just go with the flow when he was high. I've also wondered if the usage of H was justified due to some of the musical influences the band had. Flea actually originally wanted to become a jazz musician, and many jazz musicians in the past would use the drug. One that comes to mind is Mal Waldron, actually, as he admitted that he felt like a jazz musician was practically required to use it in order to keep up with the demand of the music industry. Another example actually would be about Eric Dolphy, who was mistakenly thought to have been overdosing or who was mistakenly thought to have overdosed on drugs, when in reality he was suffering from complications of untreated diabetes. In general, it seems that any information about What Is This is hard to find. I listened to their debut album, which is thankfully uploaded onto YouTube, though it's not the best quality. The video itself, I think, is like 15 years old. I don't think that the music is bad, but having listened to Hillel play on that album, and then later on the Peppers albums, I personally feel like What Is This was not utilizing his talents enough. After high school, Hillel did not go to college. He would join Anthony for lunch many times at UCLA, and later on, Anthony, Hillel, and Flea would go to restaurants together. The trio would go to high-traffic restaurants, then individually leave the table, slipping through the door. It wasn't until many years later that Anthony realized how dining and dashing would hurt the employees, and he'd go back to put some money in their tills. When Anthony would get out of class, he'd meet up with Hillel and hang out with him on weekends to get high on pot. Anthony recalled Hillel as a late bloomer to drug use, but loved his weed. He relished the time that was spent with Hillel, as he didn't care for college much. Anthony recalled being 14 years old when he shot coke for the first time, and at the end of his senior year of high school, he started shooting up again. One of these times, Anthony called up his girlfriend of the time and told her, "This is the greatest feeling ever. We have to do this together." Also, at the age of 14, Anthony took heroin for the first time, though it was completely accidental. He recalled in Behind the Music that he saw a line of white powder on the table at his father's house and snorted it all, originally believing it was cocaine. It turned out to be China White. While this is a story about Hillel, I do think it's important to understand where Anthony was in his life. He and Hillel both struggled with addiction, Anthony being exposed to drugs for a much longer time than Hillel had been, and eventually their stories had intertwined.
My dad was very involved in chasing girls and having different girlfriends and very open about his sexual existence.
Anthony says his dad was a flamboyant playboy who introduced him to sex and drugs, all at a tender age.
I started dabbling with heroin when I was 14. That's the first time I tried it. And it was kind of by accident, actually. I thought it was cocaine. And it was white and it was sitting on a table, so I went and did it, and I got high, and I liked it very much. You know, I thought it was a beautiful feeling.
Anthony, Flea, and Hillel graduated from high school in 1980, but the friends remained inseparable. The trio knocked around for a few years. Anthony did a short stint at UCLA, while Flea and Hillel continued to pursue music.
At some point in his life, though it never seemed to have been specified when, Hillel developed a serious heroin addiction. In the RHCP episode of Behind the Music, Anthony Kiedis stated that Hillel started using heroin a little after him. This might have been in 1982, from my own personal speculation. In his book, Anthony didn't see the drug usage during that time as a road to death and insanity. I just saw it as a beautiful, beautiful feeling. Anthony wrote down about how the fall, after the high, was one of the worst feelings ever. Dante's Inferno times 10. It was one of the reasons why Anthony took heroin a few years later. The 80-foot pillow to break that cocaine fall. Anthony's life growing up was tumultuous, as he had moved in with his father as a child. His father did not shelter him, and in fact allowed extremely adult things to freely roam in Anthony's young life. Anthony admitted to never having any qualms about using needles to ingest drugs. He even used shooting up as a weird art project, where he shot up in front of his girlfriend's car, drawing blood, then walked up to her car and squirted the blood back into the palm of his hand, smearing the blood on his mouth, making bloody kisses all over her windshield and the driver's side window. In his book, Anthony wrote that he was comfortable with syringes, but had a hard time finding them. One day he got the idea to act like a diabetic, ordering insulin first, and then throwing in the syringes second. It was a scam that worked for years. When Anthony was in college, his drug usage increased exponentially. One story from him was about how he got a job as a live-in caretaker for a boy while the mother would be at work. The boy was on Ritalin and apparently had ADHD. In his book, Anthony didn't feel like the boy had ADHD, but rather just needed someone to play with. Anthony had read that Ritalin had a stimulating effect on adults. He invited Flea and Hillel over one night where they decided to test those theories. With the medicine and a bottle of stolen Finnish vodka, they were off to the races. We ate handfuls of the Ritalin and became 3 drunk comets running around the house. The kid had a great time, and when his mom and her date came home a bit tipsy, she partied with us, never realizing we were high on her son's meds. Eventually, though, she fired me from the job. Anthony had been in a relationship with a girl named Haya, who was of Jewish background. Her family didn't approve of the relationship, as Anthony wasn't Jewish. At the end of his first year at college, the relationship was coming to an impasse, mainly due to Haya's family's disapproval. Hillel gave Anthony a chai, the Hebrew symbol that signifies life, and he wore the chain around his neck. This baffled Haya's father, who asked Anthony his background, where he replied that he was mostly Lithuanian. This relationship did not last, though, and the couple actually broke up at Hillel's house in his room. Thinking about it now, I don't know why Anthony didn't cook up some scheme to pull the wool over Haya's father's eyes. Couldn't they have potentially made it seem like Haya was dating Hillel? I'm not sure if the thought ever occurred to them, though of course it doesn't matter now, so many decades later. After the breakup, Anthony moved into a small house by the Formosa Cafe with Flea and another old-school friend. In his book, he wrote that he and Flea wouldn't let our jobs get in the way of our partying, and shot a lot of coke. When the school friend planned to go skiing for a few days, Anthony, Hillel, and Flea planned to have the party to end all parties. Flea and Anthony went on a booze-stealing binge, and Hillel passed out flyers. The party was ridiculously huge, and a huge mess had to be cleaned up before their roommate came back. Anthony wrote that, during this time, he had definitely become a cocaine addict. They had a fairly constant supply, since Anthony and Flea were making money, with the latter trading base lessons for coke from a Topanga Canyon dealer. As soon as the lessons finished, they'd be shooting the cocaine. Anthony recalled needing the drug psychologically, feeling addicted to it that way first, as opposed to physically. Eventually, Anthony would have episodes of full-blown cocaine psychosis. While abusing cocaine, Anthony would also use speed. He met a punk rock girl who convinced him to shoot up speed, where he could be high for 2 days, for only $20. He recalled having to draw when doing speed, coke, or speed balls, that or having sex. In his book, he wrote that heroin wasn't prominent in the drug scene back in the summer of 1981. Now, he saw a group of punks nodding out one time and thinking that didn't look like too much fun. He also had the thought in the back of his head of, you've got to find that heroin again. That's the drug that people are afraid of, so it's got to be the best drug. One day, an obvious user came into Anthony's job, and eventually this guy was Anthony's connection to Trying H. They made plans for the man to come to Anthony's place and do heroin. Anthony was so excited, rushing home to tell Flea and their other roommate that he was going to shoot up that night. They cautioned him, saying, "What? You can't shoot up heroin, you'll die." Anthony told them that the man had been shooting up for a while, and so the other two decided to watch him and Anthony. Anthony recalled the man coming over and being taken aback to seeing an audience sitting around the kitchen table. He set up the spoons and the whole ritual of cooking up this Persian dope, something Anthony hadn't ever seen before. Because it was oil-based, he needed a lemon to cook it up with. First, he fixed himself and got a little stoned. Then he said, "It's your turn." He fixed up the rig, and it was brown. I'd never shot up anything that was brown before. Everyone was on pins and needles, wondering if I was going to die. Anthony didn't feel anything, if much at all, and after a second shot, still didn't feel much of a high. The guy had only scored weak dope that night. Admittedly, Anthony wasn't inspired to seek out more heroin after this event. Not long after that, Flea and Anthony were kicked out by that roommate for the huge party they once had. Flea ended up crashing at a place called the Cash Club. It was run by a woman named Janet Cunningham that would allow actors, painters, and musicians to crash at the loft area for free. Flea moved in when Larry Fishburne lived there, along with a drummer named Joel and French painter named Fabrice. Anthony would crash at this place since Flea was staying there. In his book, he stated that this was when they started doing heroin. Fabrice would get steady sources of China White. Mike started sniffing it too, but he always remained a lightweight around heroin. The joke was that all you had to do was show him a bindle of age, and he'd start vomiting. Anthony got a mohawk after this, as cut by Hillel. He'd either stay with Flea or at Hillel's house, which was a favorite spot of his. Anthony recalled Hillel's family always making him feel welcome and never like the loser I was, even though one time I overstayed my welcome and Hillel came to me and said, "I think if you stay on the couch tonight, my mom's going to have a little more than she can handle. She's been through a rough time of her own." Anthony slept in the car outside that night, and in the morning Hillel invited him in for coffee and toast. Anthony descended more into drug use, going on binges. Flea moved to another building with Joel and Fabrice, Hillel becoming a semi-resident too. This was during the time that Anthem had become What Is This, and they played more live shows, developing a cult following. Flea's talent showed through, and he was asked to audition for the band Fear. This was a bombshell to Anthony, and Flea stated that if he had to choose between the two different styles of music, he'd go with Fear, of which he got the job. He was reportedly nervous to face Hillel, the same man that taught him to play bass to begin with. When he did, Hillel didn't take the news well, stating, "I have no words for you," and left the room that they were in. What Is This replaced Flea with mediocre bassists, and Flea vaulted into mini punk rock stardom. What Is This continued on and performed many shows along the California coast. Flea and Hillel did not communicate for several months, but Hillel knew that he had to forgive Flea. Something in him knew that, even though he'd been wronged, it was Flea's destiny, and he had to swallow his ego a bit and allow Flea to flower. It was hard, because none of us had any father figures to consult with on these heavy issues. They became friends again and resumed jamming. In the summer of 1982, Anthony heard the song The Message by Grandmaster Flash and fell in love with it. The song inspired him and Hillel to create rhymes and characters of their own. The Message was a light bulb moment for Anthony, who realized that you didn't have to have a voice like Al Green or Freddie Mercury to have your own place in music. In February of 1983, Gary Allan and Neighbors' voices were set to play at the Rhythm Lounge at the Grand Air Room of Melrose. A few days before the gig, he suggested that Hillel, Flea, and Anthony open for his band and do one song with Anthony fronting. Flea and Hillel were initially skeptical, since Anthony wasn't known for being a singer back then, though Gary Allan recognized Anthony's potential as a performer. The group put something together, with Anthony realizing that he could try rapping a poem, as inspired by Grandmaster Flash. They gathered influence from artists like Jimi Hendrix, Defunct, and Gang of Four. Anthony wrote that they wanted to do something with funk, since What Is This had nothing to do with the genre. The group didn't have space to rehearse, nor was it something that they took very seriously. So the group decided all we really needed to do was get together in Flea's living room at the Wilton Hilton and have an a cappella rehearsal. Anthony remembered Flea and Hillel having such exquisite telepathy going on that they could just look at each other and know what to play. So Flea came up with his bass line, and Hillel invented a funky guitar riff, and Jack Irons laid down a beat. Then I went off to write some lyrics. Anthony wrote the lyrics to a song that later became Out in L.A. It was about his friends and their wild nightlife scene. Some of the people mentioned Flea, Keith Barry, and Hillel. The band was called Tony Flo and the Miraculous Masters of Mayhem, something that wasn't intended as a permanent name, though it did reference the way that they wanted to play music, which was majestic and chaotic. The group showed up to the Rhythm Lounge, where there was about 30 people, all to see Neighbors' Voices. Despite Anthony actually being sober for this, Flea had been snorting heroin before the show. Despite no one paying attention to the group when they appeared, by the time they finished, the crowd was completely stunned and speechless, frozen in their tracks. After this, the DJ/owner Solomon rushed out of his DJ booth and passionately asked the band to come back the next week, asking if they'd have 2 songs by then. Anthony agreed to it, even though the band hadn't planned on playing again. The guys got back together during the following week and wrote a song called Get Up and Jump. The most memorable line being about a girl Hillel had a crush on named Rona Frumpkin. The line, "Hillel be jumping on that little baby Frumpkin. Say what, you got a pumpkin in your pants?" was a nod towards how proud Hillel was of his package. Anthony wrote that the guys would joke about it a lot, as Hillel would form a pumpkin shape with it, which was even more pronounced around his crush. At the second show, the band decided to get more theatrical, choreographing a dance to popular song of the time, Pack Jam. The club was packed, and the guys got on stage with the song playing, trying to do a robotic dance, but Jack Irons couldn't get quite synchronized. So they abandoned the bit and went into playing Out in L.A. and Get Up and Jump. Anthony's lyric about Hillel and his crush seemed to work, as she took interest in him that night after they played. After the second show, the guys realized how much they enjoyed the band and didn't want to give it up. They had to think up a more serious name for the group, and it's been disputed who came up with the name officially, either Flea or Keith Barry. The name Red Hot Chili Peppers was an amalgamate of other names that the guys would brainstorm, as many artists had Red Hot this or Chili that. Louis Armstrong even had his Hot 5. Essentially, it was a red hot pepper mash. Around this time, Anthony, Hillel, and Flea combined resources to rent an incredibly inexpensive 3-bedroom house on an infamous street called Leland Way, which was a 1-block street that was known as Pot Alley because the Mexican mafia dealt pot there. It was a very dangerous, unsavory neighborhood filled with drug dealers and bums, but we didn't care. In fact, it gave me material for our songs. One such song was Police Helicopter, which is on their first album. Hillel would always be playing guitar, and Flea would be on the porch playing bass. The Peppers' third show was at the Café de Grand, where they were supposed to be paid $200. There were only 30 people, in a venue that could have hosted way more. But the band had a rooting section. They played 4 songs that night, the 2 from before and 2 new ones. Police Helicopter and a song called Nevermind. The latter was a diss track, essentially, where Kiedis would try to say never mind to the other guys. Popular bands at the time such as Duran Duran, Men at Work, and people like that. And instead of paying attention to those guys, pay attention to them. This song would later feature on their second album, Freaky Styley. Between the songs that night, the Peppers would perform a cappella chants derived from schoolyard camp songs. Hillel introduced them to one song called Stranded, where they put their hands in the air and sang, "Stranded, stranded, stranded on the toilet bowl. What do you do when you're stranded and there ain't nothing on the roll? To prove you're a man, you must wipe with your hand. Stranded, stranded, stranded on the toilet bowl." Though the crowd loved the show, the promoter tried not to pay the band. He gave Anthony only $40, and so Anthony had to shake him to get any sort of extra cash, which still didn't amount to $200. A song from this time period was written called Green Heaven. It was written in 24 hours and became a centerpiece for their shows. Hillel would do a talkbox intro for the song, using a big plastic tube out of a guitar box alongside a mic. He'd put the tube down his throat and play guitar. Though the Red Hot Chili Peppers was a band, Flea would still practice with Fear, and Hillel and Jack would practice with What Is This? The Peppers weren't seen as a career move, just a fun thing to do. No one thought of quitting their other bands to be a full-time Pepper. Soon after, Anthony, Hillel, and Flea moved in together, and Hillel fell in love with someone new. Anthony wrote, "When Hillel fell in love, he disappeared. He's your best friend, he's with you day and night. He falls in love. See you next year." This would leave Flea and Anthony together a lot to go gallivant around town. A couple of months after the Peppers started performing, they made a demo. Spit Sticks, the drummer for Fear, was their recording engineer, and they rented out 3 hours at a hole-in-the-wall studio on Hollywood Boulevard. The entire budget was $300. They recorded 6 songs and a few a cappella ditties. Later, in July of that year, the Peppers got a gig with the Kit Kat Club, a classic strip club that was putting on rock shows. At Hillel's request, they learned Jimi Hendrix's song Fire. This show would start the iconic coming out on stage and nothing but socks on their packages. The band got a record deal with EMI, and around the same time, What Is This got a record deal too, though with a different company. Jack and Hillel left the Peppers to play with What Is This, and the Peppers had to replace the two. They ended up being replaced with Cliff Martinez and Jack Sherman. The band recorded their first album in this lineup. Hillel rejoined the Peppers in 1985. For their second album, George Clinton was recruited to produce it. They had 70% of the songs written, such as Jungle Man, American Ghost Dance, and Battleship. Nevermind, which I assume they just decided to make into one word, and Sex Rap, were actually written on their original demo, and 30 Dirty Birds was an old Hillel camp song. George Clinton's vision was that they'd hang out with him in Detroit for about a month before going into the studio, so there was more room to write more songs. They recorded in George's studio, United Sound, which was a studio that he had taken over from Motown. The band lived in Clinton's house before renting their own place. Hillel and Anthony shared a room, Cliff and Flea in another. The idea was to stay out of the city until they got the ball rolling. Soon into this, Anthony started going into heroin withdrawal. The band sent out for $500 worth of coke, where Lindy, the band manager, Hillel, Flea, George, and Anthony hoofed it all up. Anthony felt great for half an hour, then went back to no sleep and dope sickness. After a few days, it subsided. The band eventually finished the album, which was titled Freaky Styley, and went back to L.A. Anthony got into a friendship with a woman named Kim, who was a drug user like him. The two would buy heroin on the corners around Hollywood, and the two would be with Hillel at times, who was using too. He had a crazy girlfriend named Maggie, who was a friend of Kim's, so we'd have a lot of small drug parties. The band went on a small tour to San Francisco, and during one moment Anthony made a speech about not doing drugs. A filibuster that went on, but apparently caught the ears of the audience. A month later, they went on tour for Freaky Styley, but the speech did little for Anthony himself or Hillel. They were strung out, Anthony noticing that Hillel wasn't doing so well. He seemed weak, and didn't seem to have that same Israeli fire stoking like he always had in the past. It became evident when we started our usual on-tour wrestling division. Hillel and I teamed up. I was his manager, and he was set to wrestle Flea. Even though Flea was real solid, Hillel was bigger, and he had massive tree trunk legs. We had a 2-week build-up to this match, and when they wrestled in a hotel room one night, Flea destroyed him in as long as it takes to grab somebody and hurl them to the ground and pin them mercilessly to his death. 10 seconds. I could tell that Hillel had no inner core of strength. He had been robbed by his addiction of the life force that allows you to at least defend yourself. It was a sad moment. The two tried to keep the other from using during this tour, as recalled by Anthony. Hillel and I didn't do heroin on the road, so we would drink bottles of Jägermeister because that gave us the closest feeling to a heroin high. He'd always tease me that I was a sloppy drunk because I'd get drunk and take off all my clothes in the motel and walk down the hall and knock on people's doors, whereas he'd get drunk and act suave. When the tour was over, they would go back to using again. Anthony would divide the heroin he'd score with his friend Kim and take 75% of it, since he had a higher tolerance. Kim did not know this, and one night this almost killed her. It happened at Hillel's one night. He had moved into an infamous Hollywood haunt called Milagro Castle. Marilyn Monroe had once lived there, but now it was populated with drug dealers and punk rockers. One night after we scored some China White, Kim, Hillel, and I went to his place to do the drugs. Hillel had his bindle, Kim had our bindle, and for some reason, Hillel offered to share his with Kim, so I could have a whole bindle to myself. I was in such a frenzy over doing my stuff that it didn't dawn on me that Hillel would actually split his bag 50-50 with Kim. The high was amazing, and I remember Hillel and I going into the kitchen and sharing some Lucky Charms, dancing and talking and generally exuberant about how potent the drugs were. Then I realized that we hadn't heard a peep out of Kim for a while. It dawned on me that she'd taken much more than she ever had before. I rushed into the living room and saw Kim sitting upright in the chair, basically dead. She was cold and white. Her lips were blue, and she wasn't breathing. I remembered all the techniques for reviving someone from a heroin overdose that Blackie taught me when I was 13 years old. I picked her up, dragged her into the shower, turned the cold water on her, and began giving her major mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. I was frantically slapping her face and screaming, "Kim, don't fucking die on me. I don't want to have to call your mother and tell her daughter's gone. I don't want to have breakfast alone tomorrow." She started going in and out of consciousness. I was shaking her like a rag doll, screaming, "Stay awake!" Hillel had called 911, and when the paramedics showed up, I jumped out the window and ran away, because I had outstanding warrants for my arrest for moving violations. Hillel went to the office with her, and they got her up and running. About 12 hours later, I called her room in the hospital. "Come and get me! These motherfuckers ruined my high! I'm sick. We need to go cop." Amazingly enough, it never occurred to me that there might have been a problem there. The Red Hot Chili Peppers toured off and on until the spring of 1986, and then they had to think about their next album. EMI gave the band $5,000 to make a demo, which was a pretty high amount, as thought by multiple people. The band had Keith Levine as the producer, who was also a heroin addict. Hillel and Keith earmarked $2,000 for drugs alone. The day they spent the money, Anthony was late to the writing session and came into the studio to find a mountain of cocaine and a small molehill of heroin. Hillel was fucking gazacked. They told me that the first $1,500 worth of drugs had already been consumed. So I started scooping and grabbing and got so loaded I was in no shape to be part of a creative process. Cliff Martinez was fired from the Peppers and replaced with Jack Irons. Eventually, the band started writing for their third album. Songs like Skinny Sweaty Man and No Chump Love Sucker were written in honor of Hillel, the latter being about how he'd been left high and dry and shattered by a girlfriend who dumped him for another guy with more money and more drugs. It was a sort of revenge song about the materialistic woman, Anthony wrote. Because of Anthony's drug use, he was kicked out of the band and later went back to Michigan with his mom. He got sober at the Salvation Army and stayed that way for 50 days. When he got back to LA, he was still sober, though after that 50th day, Anthony started using again as a treat. The band recorded their third album, and Anthony used Hillel as his vocal producer. He recalled Hillel saying, "I'm telling you, this is the most beautiful thing we've ever done. I can't wait to release this record." By the time of the Uplift Mofo Party Plan's release, Hillel was deep into his addiction. Around this time period, though, I'm not sure when exactly, as I never saw any information except for the writing credits on Discog, the Peppers had also played on Keith Levine's solo record, Violent Opposition. The album came out in 1989, but it has Flea on the track, I'm Looking for Something, and Hillel and Jack on If 6 Was 9, a Jimi Hendrix cover. When it came time to tour the album, Anthony wrote that they played some of the greatest shows of their lives during that tour, mainly because he and Hillel were obsessed with getting high. Though they drank a lot, did coke whenever we could, smoked a lot of pot, and maybe had one shipment of dope sent out. After the tour, the two descended further, Anthony almost having to spend 90 days in jail, and Hillel struggling in private. Before, we'd be together, or there'd be girls involved, a whole party atmosphere. Now, it was more reclusive and isolated. There was a dark feeling to it. He was going off into a more constant and necessary use of heroin and cocaine, and I was becoming more of a periodic binger. People always murmured and rumored behind my back about how I'd be the first person they knew who'd die of drugs. Every now and then, even Hillel would come to me and say, "Dude, don't kill yourself. Look at you. You're so close to death." That winter, the band toured Europe. London was their first stop, and on the night of the show, Hillel was too sick to leave his room, suffering from heroin withdrawal. Flea and I went to his room, and it was incredibly sad to see him losing the battle with his darkness. He didn't have that look in his eye that said, "Yeah, I'm losing. I'm going to fight this thing through." Instead, he was wailing, "I can't do this. I'm dying here." The guys convinced him to come to the club, but Hillel was not part of what was happening. The group tried to play another song, and Hillel stopped, mumbling, "I can't do this," leaving the stage. Anthony ran backstage to find Hillel slumped over, his head in his hands. Anthony told him, "Hillel, you can do this. Get your fucking guitar and come back." Hillel moaned, "No, I can't. Cancel it. It's over." And the band played that night without Hillel on stage. The drug usage led to bickering, and the band would go on stage as a three-piece at times. Hillel would disappear into the city, or would be lying backstage unable to play, unwilling to move. The tour had more good moments than bad, according to Anthony, and then they flew to New York for a show at NYU. Anthony made a deal with Hillel not to get high before the show because New York was Dope Town. Anthony lost sight of him, though, and Hillel was later found backstage, high on smack. This angered Flea and Anthony, who told him that they needed to play the show first. If Hillel wanted to party, he could do it after. When they got back to L.A., they fired Hillel. Hillel had started to miss band rehearsals, and Flea was like, "Fuck this. Hillel, you're out of the band." They replaced him with Blackbird McKnight, but after a few days they gave Hillel another chance. The band went back to Europe playing a few festivals. On the way to Oslo, Norway, Hillel and Anthony shared a berth in the bus they were in. They looked out at the scenery and talked about everything. A lot of what we talked about was drugs and heroin, and where we were with our addiction, and what we wanted to do about it. We were still pretty clueless as to the nature of the disease. I had a little more experience with meetings than Hillel. I took Hillel to a meeting once, but he hated to admit that he had a problem. He hated to admit that somebody could help him, and he was generally shy of crowds. After that, I could never get him to a meeting again. On the train, they vowed to stop using. In the same breath, we joked about Oslo being the heroin capital of Scandinavia. That was an ongoing thing with us. Whatever town we were in would become the heroin capital of the world. I could see that neither of us were committing to anything positive. It was more like, let me get high first, and then I'll see. We both realized that we were at a point in our life where it was do or die. After Oslo, they flew back to LA. We landed at the airport, gave one another a hug, and it was great tour. Great being with you. Call me in a few. I'll be good. You gonna be good? Yeah, I'll be good too. We said goodbye. And then Hillel and I made a beeline for our individual dealers. In a 1993 article with Spin magazine, Anthony is quoted, "Hillel was a wild partier. Before he got carried away with the drugs, he was a lot of fun. We would both clean up, and then we would both start using again." During one of these moments of being clean, Anthony wanted to take Hillel with him to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. Hillel laughed, saying, "Why? I'm not an alcoholic." While Anthony would make drug deals in front of his bandmates at times, Hillel was more private about his usage. The Spin article claimed that the sources Hillel got his stash from were unknown, at least in comparison to Anthony, who was open to admitting that he'd score from gang members. The Peppers were remembered for being hard partiers during those days, a former dealer quoted as saying, "When they came through town, every town, it was as if every scuzzball on the street knew about it and would make certain he was backstage." By early 1988, Hillel's problem was evident to everyone. Slovak looked haunted. His eyes, so laughingly alive earlier in the day, were clouded, whether by grief or pain, or something else entirely. It was impossible to ascertain. Anthony recalled, Hillel was much more subtle a bit, and much more cunning in his disguise. Even at the time of the article in 1993, people were still shocked and did not know how far Hillel had gone.
Hillel's health was in decline, and it was getting harder to conceal his addiction. Then a roadie concerned for his well-being approached Hillel's brother.
He said, "Your brother's doing heroin." I didn't believe it at first, but he said, you need to know it's getting out of hand. No one wants to tell you. So I confronted my brother about it. He begged me not to tell my mom, so I didn't. I would have told my mom if I had a second chance.
Entries in a journal reveal Hillel's desire to stay clean. James Slovak says his brother's diary outlines his devotion and love for music.
How I know my brother was hurting to get off of drugs is he writes stuff like this. He says, "F drugs. Music is my destiny. Even though I don't necessarily feel it now, I know soon I will feel that this experience will make me stronger.
We were touring in Europe, and both Hillel and Anthony were having problems at the time, but they were, as a team, united to clean up. And they did. They were doing great. But we've been working really hard for a long, long time, and they were kind of fried. We came back, and I think pretty much everybody said, hey, I'm going to go my way, you go your way, and I'll speak to you in like 3 weeks.
But without the mutual support between Hillel and Anthony, the time apart proved to be ill-fated.
When we got back from playing, we were pretty much just on a clean-headed level. And we both disappeared into our own worlds of getting high again.
Returning from the European tour, the guys parted ways and agreed to get in touch around 3 weeks later, according to Behind the Music. Hillel isolated himself from the rest of the band and struggled to resist the drug abuse without the support of his friends, and Anthony in particular. He stopped writing in his diary during this time, along with painting, and so little is known about this time period. On June 24, 1988, Hillel called his brother James, where he told him that he was having difficulty staying clean, despite his desire to stop taking heroin. A few weeks after the band returned from tour, the band members tried to contact Hillel, but were unable to do so.
Several days later, on Friday, June 24th, James received an unexpected phone call from Hillel.
He told me that he was thinking about the heroin again, and I begged him not to do it. And told him it was like Russian roulette, that, you know, spinning the barrel, you can die at any time, and there was a big pause, and he said I was right. And that was like actually the first time he said, I love you. And I said to him, I said, let's start hanging out more often, let's start doing things together. And he said, definitely, definitely. And I didn't have that chance, because after that...
That would be the last conversation James would have with his brother. Hillel hung up the phone and shut himself off from the world.
We couldn't find Hillel, you know. I'm their manager. My job is basically to be a pain in the ass and call everybody every day. Hey, what are you doing? How are you? What's going on? And I couldn't get an answer on Hillel. We called, you know, anybody, you guys hear from Hillel? You hear from Hillel? Nobody heard.
The weekend passed, and still no one was able to reach Hillel. Then on Monday, June 27th, the horrible truth was discovered. Police entered Hillel's apartment and found his body. Authorities believe a few days prior, on June 25th, 1988, 26-year-old Hillel Slovak had overdosed on heroin.
The night he called me and said, I love you, he knew he was going to do heroin that night. He was ashamed of it, I'm pretty sure. He was like, how did I get wrapped up in this drug?
I did not accept the news. I was, very much under the influence when I got it. I came back after being gone for a few days from my house, and my girlfriend told me, and I just refused to accept it.
Anthony, having lost one of his closest friends, escaped to a small fishing village in Mexico. There he tried in vain to kick heroin on his own.
I didn't actually stop using at that point. For whatever reason, you would think your best friend dies. Okay, I've had enough. But it doesn't work like that, at least with my experience.
10 days later, Anthony returned to Los Angeles and checked himself into drug rehab. Though it would be a lifelong battle that he wouldn't always win, Anthony was determined to stay clean.
I got back from Mexico and got out of the hospital and, one more time said, okay, I'm going to be cool now. And then it was Flea and Jack and myself and our manager, Lindy, sitting on a sailboat in the Pacific Ocean. And we decided to talk about what we were going to do.
Saddened by his friend's death, Jack Irons quietly announced that he was leaving the band.
And he left, and sort of Flea and I looked at each other and we said, what do we do?
I was going through a hard time, and, he just made a mistake, took the wrong drugs, wrong time, and he didn't make it.
Hillel passed away on June 25th, 1988, and his body was not found until 2 days later. Hillel was not found until July 27th, slumped over the painting that he'd been working on at the time of his death. He was found holding a cigarette which had burnt a hole in the canvas. Unconscious, he had slipped into a coma and then slipped into the Reaper's arms. An autopsy was performed on June 29, 1988, which was the day before his funeral. A coroner told the press that the results were inconclusive, though the streets did not whisper about what led to Hillel's death. On behind the music, there were shots of Hillel's death certificate, which stated that he had died from an accidental heroin and cocaine overdose. Hillel Slovak was buried at Mount Sinai Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills, California. He was 26 years old. In his book, Flea wrote, "I miserably watched him descend into the false Eden of junkiedom, and didn't think about his pain, but instead about what was happening to me. Self-righteously I judged. The pretense of the junkie lifestyle being a romantic thing pissed me the fuck off. He thought he was being an artistic and mysterious poet when he was strung to the gills, and I thought he was being full of shit. Me, with no pale, skinny, hypocritical leg to stand on. I did it myself. A once-in-a-whiler, a weekend warrior. I never got strung out." June 27th, 1988, was a nice, hot summer day in Hollywood. We'd been home from a grueling European tour for a week or so. I was relaxed, unwound, and hanging with my awesomely pregnant wife, Louisa. I felt whole. The recently completed tour had begun with Hillel in a state of weakness. He was pale, depleted, and ghostly. His spirit diminished. During the first show, he left the stage after one song, unable to keep it together because of dope sickness. He gathered his strength as the tour progressed, though, and as he kicked the habit, his soul, humor, and flowing funk grew back into its naturally evolved state. It had become clearer than ever that this drug thing was no game. I saw it rob Hillel of his natural truth for a time. This was no experimental romance of youth anymore. It was fucking terrible. Flea had gone out that afternoon and spent time with family and friends. When he arrived home, he noticed a plethora of messages on his answering machine, and the phone was constantly ringing. Louisa, his wife, answered the phone and remained silent. Confused, she gave him the phone, and that's when he got the news that Hillel had passed away. There weren't any details in his book about the events or the funeral, though years later, Flea still blamed himself for not having been able to do more. I saw his drug self go weak, hollow, and dishonest. I felt abandoned. I didn't understand why he and Anthony would become addicted like that. I blindly saw a traitor to the cause, my hurt feelings, my severed connection. I could have saved him. He could have figured it out. We were all of us bungling and banging foolishly through the danger zone. Long as I live, I will know I failed. Please forgive me, Hillel. I knew not. I was blinded by the only thing that gave me sight, and polluted with arrogance and ambition. If only I knew what love was. As it stood in the broad and baking LA daylight, while I shoveled dirt down onto the cold darkness of his coffin at the Mount Sinai Cemetery, his grandfather sternly asked me, in his thick Eastern European accent, "Why didn't you tell us?" Anthony had heard of Hillel's death through his girlfriend of the time. He had actually been coming home from a speedball binge and called her on the payphone. His girlfriend was screaming for him to come home. Something happened to Hillel, and immediately Anthony was in denial. She's confused. Maybe he just OD'd, and she thought that must mean he's dead. When he got home, Anthony's girlfriend came running up to him, crying and screaming, "Your friend Hillel is dead." She lost it. You would have thought that he was her best friend. But she felt all of this pain immediately, whereas I refused to accept it. There must be some mistake. Deep inside my core, I knew that he was gone, but I would not allow myself to accept that then. Anthony did not go to Hillel's funeral. He couldn't process the reality that his best friend had died from the same addiction that he was suffering from. He spent 10 days in a remote fishing village in Mexico, going through an informal sort of detox. Various sources give various dates as to how long Anthony stayed in that remote village, from 10 days to 1 month to 3 months. Anthony wrote, "There was never anyone to blame when people get into drugs. They're always responsible for their own behavior. And it's not the dealer, it's not the friend, and it's not the bad influence. It's not the childhood." People associated Anthony with being responsible for Hillel's death, partly because Anthony's addiction started when he was much younger. Jack Irons called a band meeting, which was held on the manager's sailboat. Jack sat them down and said, "This is not where I want to be. I do not want to be part of something where my fucking friends are dying." And Jack quit the band, everyone understanding. Anthony went back to rehab after that. 2 weeks in, his sponsor, Bob Timmons, took him to Hillel's grave. He told Anthony, "Why don't you do me a favor and talk to Hillel and tell him how you feel about him dying? And why don't you make a promise right now that you're not going to put another needle in your arm and you're not going to drink and use?" Anthony protested at first and then decided to do it. He started with, "Yo, Slim," his common greeting for Hillel, and then emotions washed over him. It was like this wall came down in a second. I started weeping like I never wept before. I cried all the way out of that cemetery. Jack Irons was later replaced with Chad Smith, and Hillel was replaced with John Frusciante, who was barely past the age of 18. John was heavily influenced by Hillel, and had been coming to Pepper shows from the time he was 16. After some time, the band started working on their 4th album. Anthony wrote the song "Knock Me Down," partially as a cautionary tale, but as a love song for Hillel. The song described what it was like to be a drug addict, to have that ego, and to think you are impenetrable and impervious to the forces of nature and life. The song has not been performed since 1990. The album Mother's Milk was dedicated to Hillel, with the back cover featuring art from him. Over the Peppers' career, there have been multiple songs that have been about or referenced Hillel. On Blood Sugar Sex Magic, the song "My Lovely Man" was dedicated to Hillel. The song "Other Side," which is from Californication, references Hillel in the lyrics. And on the album "By the Way," the song "This Is the Place" mentions Hillel. In 1999, Hillel's brother James published the book Behind the Sun, The Diary and Art of Hillel Slovak. The book is very rare to find today, and the website for it seems to have been long defunct. On April 14, 2012, the Red Hot Chili Peppers were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, James Slovak accepting the award on Hillel's behalf. On January 27th, 2018, Hillel's mother, Esther, passed away in Los Angeles. She's buried at Mount Sinai Memorial Park along with her parents. She was 80 years old. I can't find much on Hillel's father, and I'm not sure if he's even alive or not. Flea's book references the trio, him, Anthony, and Hillel, coming from broken families, so I'm not sure what the story is about Hillel's father. I would have to agree with Anthony's perception of Hillel as being paternal. Flea wrote about a poop incident in his book where he gave Jack Irons a bag of poop for his birthday. Jack's parents and Hillel were nonplussed. Flea wrote, "Later on, Hillel told me I had fucked up. For a different friend's birthday in the recent past, a guy whom I didn't even care about like I did Jack, I'd stolen an armful of records from Music Plus on the way to the party and given him 20 albums. I hadn't even thought about it. Hillel said, 'You give that dude a bunch of great records and you give Jack your disgusting, smelly shit?' Of course, Hillel was right. I felt like an asshole." Flea wrote of Hillel lovingly in his book, calling him his soul brother. In one video, Flea stated that he didn't intend on writing about Hillel's death in his book, but realized that there really wasn't a way around it. Even to this day, Flea admits that he wouldn't have gotten into rock music or been the bass player he is today if it weren't for Hillel. Anthony remembered Hillel in his book lovingly and fondly, as quoted on page 220. "I always had a deep connection with Hillel. He had that capacity to allow people to go past the barriers of their comfort zone with how much they wanted to reveal to people. I set up those cut-off barriers all the time with my close friends, always reserving 25% in a mystery zone. But with Hillel, you were comfortable showing that hidden 25%. I bonded with him closer than I ever did to any other male. Maybe part of it was that we shared the same sickness of drug addiction. You can't understand the experience of addiction unless you're an addict too. Hillel and I had that in common. But he also had a capacity for forgiveness that was beyond most mortals. No matter what you did, or what your flaws or failures or weaknesses were, he would never hold them against you. Unlike Flea, who had a real scrapping brother-type relationship with me, Hillel wasn't competitive. He was paternal, in a way. He wasn't a braggart. He wasn't a macho guy. He prided himself on being a man.
I loved Hillel. We all did.
He always wanted to create new music. It was all about creating a whole new sound. He didn't want to be like everybody else.
Very magical. He was an amazing musician.
In my own personal experience, I was too inspired by Hillel's playing, which really showed up as a 20-year-old in college. I got heavily into the Peppers and would practice songs like Funky Crime around the dorms and empty classrooms on campus. I loved and still love Hillel's playing, and it inspired me as a young guitar player myself. I'll always remember walking down the road in some neighborhood at my college town, listening to Freaky Styley. I would play games like Fallout New Vegas while listening to that album, and even ended up mentioning one of the songs for a college class I had. When I was 20, I had a class about Native American art history, with one of the subjects mentioning ghost dancing. Ghost dancing, in a super brief nutshell, was a ritual that some tribes would do as a way to ward off the colonizers, and in a way to bring back a life before the white people had came to America. I loved how the Peppers had incorporated such important and little known history of America's past into their music. I remember my professor, being Cheyenne himself, being impressed that the band had talked about ghost dancing in their music. I think of Hillel a lot, actually, though I never met him. I'm grateful, more than anything, that he was able to have created something so beautiful his time on this earth. I can't help but think about what life would have been like had things been a little different. I could see Hillel having done many different projects, as he was some sort of musical polytalent. I think that many of us wonder about how life could have been different. So, this is my little thank you to Hillel also. Thank you for all you created. The waves you made are still felt to this day. And I really want to thank everyone that has kept his memory alive all these years later. Creating something like this wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for those who still talked about him. Some of these people include, of course, Anthony Kiedis for writing so much about Hillel in his autobiography, and for Flea for writing about Hillel in his autobiography too. But there's also Facebook pages and James Slovak today who still talks about his brother. So to all of you, I really want to say thank you. Thank you so much.